So when we take those two, a broad definition of violence and a narrow definition of political, what we see in the US is that for a country of 330 million people, there's actually a fairly low incidence of physical political violence. There aren't a lot of people who are actually being physically injured because of their expressed political viewpoints at this moment. But the dynamic of threats and intimidation is obviously skyrocketing. So that's a real concern. And it relates to physical political violence too, because even if you have a few cases of physical political violence, it causes threats to seem credible. So the dynamic of threats is a major concern and is something we have to do something about. The way I look at it, there's actually three groups that are part of this sort of ecosystem of what generates threats. And the first group are inciters. And inciters are people who are trying to build a following. They're trying to they're sort of entrepreneurial about it, trying to get political power, create a following, sometimes monetize that following. So we tend to know who inciters are. And they engage in a sort of toxic rhetoric where they talk about their viewers as virtuous, good, upholding the highest values, and so forth. And they define another group as a fundamental threat, where that group shares collective blame for all kinds of problems. And they heat up the rhetoric to the point that violence starts to seem permissible against this perceived threat group. And that if the democratic process actually delivers an election victory to that other group, then inciters normalize the idea that perhaps democracy itself is not adequate and should be undermined. Then the next group are what I call threat makers. This group tends to be male, tends to be, according to one study by CNN, average age of about 37 years, tends to have a generally higher formal education and income level than your standard sort of general criminal population, though I would point out that because of First Amendment protections, many threats are actually not criminal in this country. And based on the data that I can read, it does seem that threat makers tend to lean more to the right wing. However, there are certainly threat makers who are on the left wing as well. And then the last group are actually enactors, people who are going to do physical violence. And interestingly enough, a lot of threat makers don't go on to enact political violence, and a lot of enactors don't necessarily make threats ahead of time. For example, the man who attacked Nancy Pelosi's husband, my understanding is he did not make threats ahead of time. The individual who shot the congressional baseball game and wounded Congressman Scalise and others, my understanding is he did not make threats ahead of time. So there are these three different groups, and sometimes they overlap, but actually I think it's helpful to think of them distinctly. But the good news is that there are a lot more of us than there are of them. And so if political violence and threats are used to try to achieve political goals, it's up to us to counter those political goals. We can make them, by organizing, less politically profitable for the people who do that.